All right, so we have a couple of questions to ask you. We
Uh-huh.
just are interested in getting magicians' opinions on on these topics. So, first one, we're gonna start off kind of easy. What is magic?
Oh, easy? You consider that an easy question? Um, I have an essay at the end of I think it's the concluding essay of my first book, Shattering Illusions, called The Pursuit in Search of Mystery, excuse me, In Search of Mystery. And one of the things I point out there is that there is no absolute definition of magic, and that it's up to the individual artist to decide what magic means. We know magic, conjuring, has something to do with fooling people and creating convincing and compelling illusions. If you want to do the most minimalist kind of definition, you can do that. Um, but but I do think that in the end, it really is up to the original artist to provide a point of view, what audiences seek. Now we're talking about theater here. What audiences seek in live performance, doesn't matter if you're a singer or a comic or a magician, is point of view. They want to know what the performer's point of view is about what they're doing. Not necessarily explicitly stated, but the tone and attitude and so forth. And then if the audience senses that, then they'll formulate their own point. They'll care enough to formulate their own point of view if they sense that the performer cares enough. If they sense that the performer doesn't really care and hasn't formulated a clear view, which is common in magic, painfully common, and that the performer is saying, for example, is of no significance, um, and or lacks any kind of commitment or authenticity, then they will disconnect and they won't formulate much of a point of view. So that point of view may be that magic is just a game, that magic is about outwitting the audience, that it's a puzzle to be solved. Or it may mean that it is, as I put it, the search for mystery. That mystery is a part of the human experience. And I think that how people respond to mysteries tells us a lot about them as individuals, because we're all faced with mysteries, but there are mysteries we can solve and may or may not want to. There are mysteries we haven't solved, we may or may not want to. There are mysteries in the world that are utterly solvable, and people will insistently pretend they're unsolvable. Oh my goodness, where did humans come from? Yeah, we pretty much have that covered. Um, so I think that tells us a lot about a person, about their approach to mystery. And I think that magic at its best, at its deepest, is a reminder that the world is filled with mystery. But then that thing about how people approach mystery and how they respond to it, if the performer, in a thoughtful way, formulates their point of view towards that fact, then that ends up defining what the performer's idea of magic is. So I think magic at its best is the experience of mystery. But the only way you can really do that, accomplish that, is it has to result in profoundly impenetrable impossibilities and not amusing puzzles. But another magician might think an amusing puzzle is exactly what I want to do.
Okay, okay. I see what you mean. Okay. And then, so if you had to categorize magic tricks, what do you see these tricks, what categories do you see them falling into?
You're
And
talking about effects, what categorizing effects of magic?
yeah, it could be effects of magic, it could be a specific type of trick. It's whatever you like believe like how magic tricks are categorized and
Well,
then how.
the work has already been done for us on this by in the limited but best of the theoretical literature in magic. And as a matter of fact, we have excellent examples of um, good solutions and answers to that question, and we have excellent examples of bad solutions. So I would offer um, Fitzky's Trick Brain, which was a book that attempted to define the effects of magic at its outset in the beginning, and then use that to create a blueprint for a kind of pseudo creativity. It's a terrible book, but a book worth reading to because it's important to figure out why it's bad. Magicians who love contests and do well in contests think it's great. I think the lawyers say the thing speaks for itself. Res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. But the point is that in the first chapter of Trick Brain, Fitzke goes through a number of his predecessors' attempts to categorize magic, and he includes Sam Sharp's theory about this from the profoundly groundbreaking theory book Neo-Magic from about 1931. And Sam Sharp categorized magical effects into 6 categories: vanish or disappearance, appearance or production, transposition, things moving from one place to another, transformation, something is small then it's large, it's red then it's green, defiance, and this is the really good solution to an annoying problem here, a vexing problem, more than annoying. Category 5 was natural laws defy. That's what I think of as the shun effects, the TION effects, which is to say levitation, animation, penetration, restoration. They all fall quite comfortably into that very succinct description: natural laws defied. And natural laws defied beyond the first 4, the previous 4, which are obviously defying natural laws. And then the 6th category is apparent mental phenomena. And under that, we include clairvoyance, telepathy, precognition, etc. I think that's a very effective system. It's a system I've used ever since the day I read Neo-Magic. And compare that with Fitzke, who, after providing Sharp's excellent system, then goes on to create a list of 19 effects. Now, I'm regarded as, something of a scholar in the magic world, an expert on the literature. If you held a gun to my head and my life depended on naming those 19 effects, I couldn't do it because they're useless. It's a really stupid system. And yet all of Sharp's categories function within that same list. So the thing about it is that the Sharp system is not only, well, it's functional, it's useful, and it's something that I remind students of all the time in helping to think about creating magic routines and creating. You have to have a clear idea what an effect is, and Vernon pointed out that one of the reasons, perhaps maybe the greatest reason, for the timeless appeal of the cups and balls is that it's the one routine trick now. I mean, this is why we have to distinguish. I encourage you to distinguish when you're asking this question in the future. What do you mean by the question? Do you mean effects, or do you mean tricks and routines? Those are 2 very different things. And the cups and balls is a routine or a trick that encompasses all the major effects of conjuring, with the exception of apparent mental phenomena, and I could even make a little case it might include that. So yeah, I think there are 6 categories, but Sam Sharp figured that out. I didn't.
Okay. What is the difference between good magic and bad magic?
What's the difference between good art and bad art? Any
I couldn't
idea?
tell you.
You couldn't tell me.
No.
Neither can anybody else. Ultimately, when we talk about valuing art, the quality of art, countless individuals over the history of the question of what is art have blathered and bumbled and bloviated. There you go. About what defines good art, or what defines art. Let's start with that. What defines art? And the problem with all those attempts, some of them quite scholarly and intellectual, the problem with all those attempts is that when they try to define, invariably, when they try and define the difference between what is art and what isn't art, and this happens in the magic world all the time, by the way. There's countless people in magic who say, "Oh, magic's not an art, but it can occasionally be an art." I think that's horseshit. But what happens is they're always trying to measure quality. So when we reach a certain threshold of quality, we hit art suddenly. And before that threshold of quality, we're not doing art. Well, this is a useless exercise. And I would quote my friend Teller on this, of Penn and Teller, who has formulated what I consider to be the most perfect definition of art, which is that art is what you do after you've milked the cows. In other words, art is not a necessity. It is therefore not merely craft. Okay.
Okay.
So you can build a chair artistically. You absolutely can do that. You might, you might, but if you're building a chair first and foremost to sit on, it's a kind of craft, right? We're doing something extra, or unless you're building a chair because it's really beautiful and fantastic, and then it's not just practical anymore. It's something beyond, right? So the point is that even though as a species we need art, but on a day-to-day basis, art doesn't appear to be, it's not what feeds you and keeps you alive. So art is just what's extra. Teller's point in this, it's not as glib as it sounds, as it may seem. Teller's point in this is, let's call everything we do that's creative art. Let's not get tied up about what's good or bad. In other words, Guernica is art, and dogs playing poker on velvet is art. Let's grant that it's all art. And if we grant that it's all art, then not only can we argue about what's good art and what's bad art, and whether or not which one of those two is better as a work of art, but we can acknowledge, before we start arguing, we have to acknowledge that that part of the argument is ultimately entirely subjective.
Mm-hmm.
So by laying that out as a foundation, that's how my thinking approaches the question of what's good magic and what's bad magic. And I suppose you could say there's a difference. I suppose we could narrow this if you want, if we wanted to, by saying, well, what's a good performance of magic? But that's a different question, as opposed to what's good magic or what's bad magic. I'm not sure. It might be mistaken as the same question. So what's a good performance of magic as a bad performance, I think, is highly subjective and very much a matter of taste. I've known some of the greatest magicians in history, and invariably there was always some equally great magician that I've known, some genius, some recognized genius, who looked at least one example of some other, what I consider to be a genius, and said, yeah, I don't get that guy's work at all. And I have multiple examples of that. It's a fascinating phenomenon to me. So that's a subjective thing about how good or bad a performance is. And if we're trying to if we're trying to judge that on a technical basis, if we strip down magic to its most minimalistic, it's not very interesting to judge it on this basis. If magic requires compelling, convincing, irrevocable evidence of an impossible illusion, in other words, a perfect deception, well, if it fails to do that, it's bad magic. If it succeeds to do that, it's good magic. But that doesn't say anything about whether it's good or bad art. You can have a great, fooling, deceptive piece that's not a very good performance because it just has a good method, or you could have something that's kind of not very convincing at all, but might be extremely entertaining. So one has to do with the definition of magic, one has to do with the definition of good or bad art.
Thank you. So then we're also really interested in finding where different magicians see the boundaries between magic and other forms of entertainment. So I'm going to give you a list of a couple of entertainment pieces that may or may not be considered magic, and I'd like your opinion on them. So the first one is pickpocketing magic?
No, it
Okay.
might use, but some pickpockets might use magic techniques,
Okay.
right? So pickpocketing is presented as a genuine skill, but that doesn't mean the pickpocket might on stage, because theatrical pickpocketing has very little to do with real world criminal pickpocketing. It has
Mhm.
almost nothing to do with it, actually. Um, and so traditionally, stage pickpocketing would typically was a skill learned by magicians, and magicians would hang a routine. Ricky Dunn, I think of, for example, a great pickpocket who I knew, would bring the spectators up, and he would set up a long magic routine, like a Bill and Lemon or something like this, or Cards Across or something like this, that would go on for a while and involve a couple of different people, and he'd use that as an excuse to be handling them and pickpocketing. So that's different than a pickpocket who was pretending to pickpocket and actually doing a magic trick. Harry Blackstone Sr. had a routine called the committee, where he had a group of people on stage, and he would apparently pickpocket all these people. And what the audience couldn't hear was him walking up to them and saying, "Give me your wallet, give me your watch." What do you call that? It sure isn't pickpocketing. It's not exactly magic either, except a very bold and crude kind. So I would say that in the bottom line, the effect of pickpocketing is not magic, but the method might be.
Okay. Um, are visual or optical illusions magic? So this would be things like the duck rabbit illusion, if you've ever
No,
seen that.
no,
Okay.
no.
And then are sideshow demonstrations magic?
As my friend Todd Robbins, maybe the best known sideshow performer in America, sideshow type performer in America, says, I will try and paraphrase him closely. Um, he says, when you see a magician, you're looking at something that's fake, but you think it's real. And when you see what I do, everything I do is real, but you think it's fake. And the reason people think it's fake, as Todd goes on to explain, is because most sideshow stunts are counterintuitive. They depend on counterintuitive principles. Isn't They depend on, he also talks about common knowledge. And then he says, common knowledge, I'm here to tell you, common knowledge is a lot of bunk. But what he means is, it's common knowledge. You can't put fire in your mouth. You can't eat glass. You can't stick a spike up your nose. Well, the truth of the matter is, you can do all those things. So sideshow, real sideshow stunts, real sideshow stunts. It's interesting. I had a discussion. I have a student who is a professional magician and also has a background in sideshow stunts. And he was asking my opinion about this because he does certain magic trick. He does some real sideshow stunts like blockhead, but then he also does a couple of magic tricks that look like sideshow stunts. And the question is that legit sideshow or not? My answer to that is depends on who's booking you and who owns the show. If the guy owns the show is a real traditional sideshow guy, real traditional hardcore sideshow people, they don't want people doing magic tricks as sideshow. They don't mind the magicians doing magic tricks. In fact, the magician is the lowest end of the entry pole in the sideshow, lowest level, easiest thing to do. So you can do magic that looks like sideshow, but that's not the same as doing real sideshow stunts. And real sideshow stunts are interesting because they're real and not magic. That's what makes them interesting. So the answer is right there.
Okay. And then is mentalism magic?
Yes.
And then is it
Now, a lot
magic?
of mentalists don't want to admit to that and are dishonest in that regard and mislabeling it for the audience. But that doesn't make it not magic. It's a branch of magic, and I would again resort to Sam Sharp, category 6, apparent mental phenomena. It's a branch of conjuring.
Is it magic if it uses camera tricks?
Yeah, it's shitty magic.
Is it
Now,
mag?
now again, I'm being glib by that shorthanded answer because I have been a consultant and a writer and the director for a number of magic special series, prominent magicians like Penn and Teller or whatever. In general, I would, if we within the magic world, and this is a discussion that probably, I don't think the public cares very much about. Well, I take that back. I take that back because I just wrote an article for an academic collection, and I discussed some cases where non-magicians wrote outrage pieces in the press about the suspicions of certain performers using either camera tricks or especially Confederates, so-called stooges. So magicians within the culture of magic regard stooges, the uses of stooges or Confederates, as a kind of low end of the gene pool. And it's done all the time, but it's frowned upon. And you don't gain the respect of your peers for doing that. So I would say camera tricks are the same thing. The thing about magic on television is, if you're really serious about magic on television, and I've been involved in a lot of quite serious magic on television, both on both sides of the camera, both as a performer and as a writer, creator. The thing you're concerned with, if you care at all about what you're doing, is credibility. Because credibility is what makes magic, the experience of magic, interesting. The effects of magic are fundamentally trivial. I have a red ball, I can make it green, worship me. That's dumb. The greatest magical effect in a conjuring show doesn't begin to touch the most minimal special effect of the movie. It matters differently. It makes a different impact on the audience because the audience is absolutely explicitly aware of conditions. That magic is special effects live, and that they can't reach out and touch or interact with the special effect of the movie screen. It's conditions that mean everything about magic, that make magic matter to people, and that creates that dissonance, that cognitive dissonance that the best of magic creates, that discomfort. And the best of magic should make people damn uncomfortable. And that's why some people don't want to do that amusing puzzle, because making the audience uncomfortable makes them uncomfortable. They desperately want to be liked. So this idea of the special effect being different than the magical effect now enters into this thing. What are we doing with television? Well, with magic on television, which is not a good medium for magic at all, but we're forced to do it because of show business, the requirements of show business. You want to, above all, have the audience have a sense of credibility. And in the early days, this is part of what this piece is that I wrote for this journal collection that's coming out soon. In the early days, Doug Henning, who created the Modern Magic TV special, would have a celebrity, James Earl Jones or whatever, stand up and basically say, I solemnly swear that everything you will see here is exactly what you would have seen if you were live in the studio audience. And it started like that. That's how we dealt with credibility. That morphed with David Blaine, who turned the camera on the audience, and the screaming audience in the street became the confirmation of credibility. Ironically, it actually let him cheat more with the camera, but not a lot, only a little. And then when Chris Angel came along and started cheating with the camera like crazy, not only were magicians upset about that and offended by that, but so was Blaine, which is kind of ironic in a way. Although I'm sympathetic to David's point about it, because when he did it, the home audience didn't suspect it. So my answer to your question has to be a little nuanced to be fair, which is, if a camera trick helps a conventional conjuring effect on television and the audience does not suspect the use of a camera trick, that might be okay. But I also have to say might, because right now we're in the midst of a current phenomenon where on social media, like TikTok and Instagram, there are a handful of performers who are using very clever computerized special effects to do very short things that look like real magic tricks, and yet they're impossible, and only an expert can tell the difference. And I know a number of professionals who find that really offensive, that if you're presenting yourself as a magician, there are rules of the road.
Okay. And then we did kind of talk about we touched on the topic of stooges, and that I'm curious about what your opinion is on instant stooges. Do you
Oh,
still
that's an
hold the same
interesting
opinion?
distinction. That's an interesting distinction. Um, I'm less troubled, and I think magicians in general are less troubled by the idea of an instant stooge because there's a certain skill and risk in that.
Hmm.
And the best way of using that um, is that that's not the whole method of the trick.
Hmm.
This is the problem. Is that if it's used in a primitive way, it's the whole method of the trick. And in that case, yeah, I think that sucks. I think that's pointless. I think that's a pointless exercise. But there's a popular term today that is wildly overused. I see it misused all the time. But there is this term, dual reality. And when dual reality is actually occurring, then that's different than instant stooging, because nobody knows that they're going along with anything. Nobody thinks they're going along with anything. And so I think it bears a kind of relationship to the notion of instant stooging, except it's better because it's no stooging at all. But if you go 1 degree off that, and the instant stooge is allowing something, uh, you know, when Penn and Teller did their first network special, not the PBS special, but network special on NBC. Don't try this at home, around 1994 or so. No, maybe it was earlier than that, 92. Anyway, I helped them teach an entire studio audience to vanish a little red hanky in a thumb tip. And that's because they had come up with this great routine called the national magic trick, where everybody recites "I shall not" or whatever the hell. It's kind of like a pledge of allegiance, except it's a pledge of allegiance to magic, and everyone does it. Instead of holding your hand over your heart or your hat over your heart, you vanish the little hanky and bring it back again. And the original concept actually was to try and do it in the stadium, but they couldn't pull it off, so we did it in the studio instead with the studio audience. Well, I helped to teach the people in the audience how to do it. And magicians were outraged. Oh, they exposed the thumb tip. But the beauty of that was, there's like 200 people in the audience. We fooled like, I don't know, 17 million people. That's a better percentage than most guys who spend a whole lifetime fooling people with a thumb tip. So anyway, that seems to be a somewhat relevant point.
Okay. And then, so we're also curious whether you think contact juggling and cardistry and like escapes are magic.
uh, so escapes is in a different category. The contact juggling and what do you say, cardistry
Yeah,
are
these are just
the same thing because they're juggling,
Mhm.
and juggling isn't magic. It's an open display of skill. Period. And that's simple. If you find anyone who disagrees with that, just sort of stop talking to them because they're idiots. And what was the other thing? Escapology. Escapology is one of those things. So we have this historical category. It's a term you don't hear these days. I think it's gone out of date, but you can find it in the old books. Allied arts. And allied arts for magic. The top of that list is ventriloquism. Right. A lot of people who become magicians, start out interested in puppetry, or vice versa. The great American ventriloquist Shari Lewis, her father was a magician. it makes perfect sense to consider ventriloquism an allied art because ventriloquism is an illusion and it's absolutely a magic trick. There's a famous story of the great American ventriloquist being on television in the early days of television. And when they were doing the run-throughs, the tech rehearsals, they kept having a problem because the mic was picking up his voice, but not the voice of the dummy. Every time the puppet spoke, we couldn't hear it. And it took a while to figure out what the hell, how could that possibly be? Then they realized that they were moving the mic, the boom mic, over to the puppet every time the puppet spoke. Proof that ventriloquism is a very convincing illusion and definitely an allied art. So escapology anyway falls under this category of allied arts because there's a traditional link between them. And that link goes back to essentially the founder. We could diddle about that, but the founder of escapology as a performance art, which is Harry Houdini, who was a magician. But although Harry loved magic and did magic, especially on his final tour, that really wasn't where his success lay. Where his success lay was as an escapologist. So the thing about escapology is that magic, well, escapology often uses deceptive techniques. The genius of Houdini was that his most famous on-stage escapes that he invented, the water torture cell, the can, the milk can, etc. They used deceptive conjuring illusion kind of methods, even though they were presented as a very authentic kind of escape. So it kind of is the same as what we were talking about before, like for pickpocketing, right? Is escapology magic? It is, I'm going to call it an allied art that may or may not use magic techniques in the method. But the method is ultimately not what the audience is perceiving. What the audience is perceiving is I think what really matters in the definition in many ways. That goes against something what I said about sideshow, but that has to do with a cultural value or an artistic value within the sideshow world. Because what you haven't asked me about, I keep waiting for you to ask me in all of these categories, is what about gambling demonstrations? Of all these examples that you cited, where there's some discussion, is this magic, is this not magic? The top of the list of that should be gambling demonstrations, because a lot of magicians use gambling demonstrations. And what's a gambling demonstration? Is it magic? Well, the fact of the matter is that most magicians who do gambling demonstrations are very often using magic techniques, but they're using magic techniques to demonstrate something that is apparently explicitly a demonstration of skill. And that's the difference. If you're doing an explicit demonstration of skill, whether it's pickpocketing or cardistry or gambling techniques, if you're doing an explicit demonstration of skill, it's not magic. By definition, it is not conjuring. But it may use a conjuring method secretly. But the effect is not conjuring if you're just demonstrating skill.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't have gambling on there, so I'm really happy you brought
It
that
should
up.
be on the top of that list.
Okay.
Of all those examples that you cited to me, the gambling is what is because it's pervasive in the magic world. And it's an interesting side thing about that, which is that it has been theorized, and I kind of go along with this, that magicians who specialize in gambling techniques, is because they can't stand the requirement of magic, which is that you utterly conceal your skill. They're all that work, all that hard work, all that expertise, all that practice, all that skill, they want to be able to show it openly. And they are very, very different things. And even though I really enjoy gambling work and I practice it, I like practicing it, I practice it all the time, but I almost never perform it because I much prefer the experience of magic and the experience of giving the experience of magic to my audience. And I even had a gig a few years ago where I was rapidly repeating sets in the same evening at this very successful show in New York called Speakeasy Magic. And I created two different two different 12-minute sets that I was alternating. And one was a gambling set, pure gambling set, and the other was a pure magic set. And eventually, I stopped doing the gambling set because ultimately it's a kind of open showing off. And that's not what magic is supposed to be. The best compliment you should be getting as a magician is, and this is the thing that people say about Tom Rees all the time, is, but he didn't do anything. You ask me, what's good magic? But he didn't do anything.
Are people like Uri Geller magicians?
Yes, unethical magicians.
Mm.
Magicians who belong in jail.
And then going off of that, then so
So just to make
go ahead.
clear what I'm saying there
Mhm.
is, ethically, he's not a magician. He's not using the label, and he's not entitled to use the label, by the way, because I think being a magician requires that the audience knows what's what and knows that deception is involved. And once you're lying about that, see, it's again that thing, it's the reverse of what I was saying before. You may present something as sideshow, as gambling, you may be as pickpocketing, you may be using magic techniques, but if the audience doesn't know it, they think they're seeing a demonstration of skill.
Mm-hmm.
So in Geller's case and his ilk, he's using magic techniques, but he's presenting it as something different. He's presenting it as real. And so he does not have the right to call himself a magician in a moral sense, because he doesn't meet the moral requirement of that. And even now, as he's tried to repackage himself as a speaker and this and that, and he's backed up a little bit and said, oh, I'm an entertainer. And that's because in 2022, it's not as palatable to people to say, I'm psychic. It's more palatable to say, I read body language, or I do NLP, or other horse shit, other pseudoscientific claims. So he says, I'm an entertainer. Now, magicians who are fans of his, we mostly call those mentalists. Magicians who are fan of his say, oh, look, now he's admitted he's a magician. No, he hasn't. You can't find one statement where he said that, where I use deception, I'm a magician, I use sleight of hand. He never said it. He's just slightly altered his claim, like any sociopath, to try and survive and keep finding new audience and new targets and new victims, like audiences of magicians who swallow that shit whole sometimes. I've seen it. I saw him get a standing ovation. I was sitting in a room full of magicians.
Okay. And then so for our next topic, we're going to be talking about misdirection. So what is misdirection?
Well, Tommy Wonder very smartly wrote an essay in the Books of Wonder that misdirection should be called, more correctly, be called direction, because the term misdirection sounds like distraction, and misdirection is not distraction, because the whole point of misdirection is to prevent the audience from perceiving that they've been misdirected. The reason Geller was so effective is because it's not just that he bent the spoons, is that people say, I never looked away. Well, of course they looked away, because the method of bending a spoon is he bends it when you're not looking. But they don't know they didn't look away. That's, if you use bold distraction, you wave the flag over here and you invade Iraq over here. If you use distraction, then the audience can reconstruct it. Oh, it must have been that moment that the gun went off that he got the elephant on stage. So misdirection is not distraction. Misdirection is actually a focus phenomenon, not unlike hypnosis in a way. It's about directing the spectator's attention so that we can use things, because we know that now that we don't see everything equally in the spatial view. We're constantly moving from point to point. And so things like change blindness or inattention blindness are key elements of misdirection, because they're happening, as a great magician named William McQueen said, it's not that the hand is quicker than the eye, it's that the eye sees a lot of things the mind never notices. He said that in the 1970s. And that's about as good a definition of misdirection as one could imagine.
Hmm.
It's about directing attention.
Is misdirection necessary for creating magic?
I would say yes. There's an interesting phenomenon that happens when you have young magicians who are extraordinarily gifted. Well, I hate that word gifted. Sorry. Who are extraordinarily talented and accomplished at a young age and have really great technical chops. They often start out with magic that's really muscular, and they don't bother with misdirection because when you're young, you think misdirection is kind of a bastard thing. You think it's for covering up lousy sleight of hand. So if you look at the early work, well, I could point to a number of magicians, but a really dramatic example is the great British sleight of hand artist Guy Hollingworth, who is a fantastic magician, one of the greatest magicians of the generation. But the material that made him famous in the early days of his career had like virtually no misdirection. He's just out there doing all of this raw sleight of hand, it's impossibly difficult sleight of hand, and he's just saying, "Go ahead, stare at my hands, knock yourself out." But as most of those magicians mature, they begin to recognize that misdirection is the final bit of seasoning that makes all magic stronger, because it's the thing that ultimately makes the illusion absolutely convincing and also drops the door on preventing people from reconstructing. John Carney is a great example of this, who was not interested in misdirection in his young days, and now thinks misdirection is the most important part of magic of all. And he's talked about this and written about this often. He's a great example. So can you get away with doing magic without misdirection? Yes, absolutely. You absolutely can, with methods that are impenetrable, perhaps mechanical, or really good sleight of hand that you choose not to misdirect. But ultimately, misdirection accounts for, it solves all problems in the sense that it's the ultimate, it's the final coat, right? After you've built something and you've assembled it and polished it and done all that work, it's the final coat that completes seamlessly, makes the illusion seamless. And so I don't know that there's any magic that doesn't benefit from misdirection, but some can be done without it. And then there's also a little subset of effects, by the way, that are what I call misdirective effects, in which the audience believes they understand the method. So a classic example would be the card under glass, which is one of my favorite tricks, which came out of the American magic bar scene of the 1930s, was invented by a guy known as Heba Haba Al. And the audience believes you're putting the card under the glass when they're not looking. That's true. But what makes a trick great is that you repeat it. And by using misdirection at a high skilled level, by directing their focus, in the end, the card's under the glass again, and they don't understand how, because they could swear they were trying to follow every move. So that's a little interesting subset of the misdirection question, which is a misdirective effect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have three more questions at least in about 12 minutes. So I just want to keep that in mind while we do this, because I
Okay.
don't want to cut you off on any answers at all. I think
Okay.
you have a lot of good things here. So the next one is, when using misdirection, what methods are you likely to employ, and when would you use them?
Well, I mean, you're directing attention, so there's the whole range of skills. It's hard to generalize about them. You know, we're using, and I have a 10-page description of the French drop, the longest description in the literature. It's in my second or third book, I think. And the French drop, which you all think you know, my description starts with the position of the feet. And to make it shorthand here, transferring an object from hand to hand, as Michael Close points out, is a very unnatural thing. It's not something we do in the real world, except in very rare occasions, like we take change and put it in the machine or hand it to the cashier. Other than that, we don't move things from here to here. We just put it where we want it. So because it's unnatural and therefore suspect, what we need to do when we're doing a French chop is to transfer everything else. We transfer tension, body tension. A tense hand is a holding hand. A relaxed hand with a broken wrist is apparently an empty hand. The greatest skills of sleight of hand, the hardest skills of sleight of hand, is what Fitzke calls simulation. And when you're doing object magic, sleight of hand with coins or cards, coins or balls or whatever, you have full hands simulating empty hands and empty hands simulating full hands. You do that with muscular tension. You do it with weight, shifting your weight. You do it with focus, right? So-called social cues, of which there's a bunch of really crappy experiments that seem to disprove the effectiveness of social cues. I call that comedy and hubris. You can put that in the hubris file. So, you know, neuroscientists would call it social cues, but there's all of this physicality and body language. A lot of it is body language, I would say, but it's really a whole host. It's very hard to categorize all that because you adapt it to the particular thing that's going on at the time. And ultimately, part of this is what you're doing is you're also trying to, and Tom Maries is a great example of this, you're also trying to control the audience's memory, not just their perception in the moment, but the story they're going to tell and what they take away when they try and reconstruct it. Tom Maries is a great example of trying to plant what the story is. Okay, so you shuffled and cut the cards? No, you didn't. And you can't just say it and have them believe it. You have to build certain elements into that, which are not readily categorizable or inventoriable, if you will, if that's a word. But you have to build the groundwork for that so that when you say the lie, they will assent to it. You're trying to gain the audience's assent for things that never happened. That's a big part of misdirection.
Okay, and then we also want to talk about offbeats. So I hear that you're pretty knowledgeable about offbeats. So gonna go, what is an offbeat?
So that goes right to my theory. And I've yet to get around to writing my really in-depth piece about this, but it's been on my list, on my essay to-do list for some years. And I've written about it very briefly. And I don't even know where, but I've mentioned it in passing. So some attentive reader must have picked up on that, which is that my personal definition of misdirection is the control of offbeats. But it's very easy in the literature. You see throughout the literature, do the top change on the offbeat. It's easy to say that. The key to misdirection, and really as I say, I'll say it again, my definition of misdirection is the use of onbeats and offbeats. But what you have to do is you have to create the onbeat. You can't really create the offbeat in a vacuum. You have to create the onbeat, and the onbeat enables or creates the offbeat. And this is related to Ascanio, the great Spanish theoretician, related to his theory of the in-transit action. When he talked about the top change, for example, it's that the spectator recognizes the starting point and the end point of the action, but the in-between action is just assumed and it's not interesting, right? So if I say, remember the nine of clubs, keep it up in your mind, you recognize when I showed it to you the first time, and you recognize where it ends at the end, the position, but the interim action, if it's natural, is of no interest to you. So you have an offbeat that you've created in Ascanio's theory, but you've created the offbeat actually by creating two onbeats, and now you find the misdirected moment that has resulted from creating and controlling the two onbeats. You have now created an offbeat in between, and that's what you can use consistently for misdirection. If you're just guessing for the offbeat and looking for the offbeat and looking for the glance away, that's not a really predictable use of misdirection. And what we want is predictable.
So one last question for you here. Is exposure bad for magic?
Again, I'll commend you to an essay of mine. I think in my first book, Shattering Illusions. I can't think of the exact title. Um, it all depends. It depends on the purpose. Um, Magic wouldn't continue to exist without exposure. And ironically, books that we consider classics now, like Hoffman's Modern Magic began, it was serialized in a public journal teaching kids magic. So it began as exposure. And magicians forget that. They don't realize that that's the origins of that book. And that's only one example. There's many. So if we're going to teach magic, we have to expose magic. Now, that doesn't mean that all exposure is created equal. There is an artistic issue, a deep artistic issue. Teller says that exposure is not a moral issue. Exposure is taught as being morally wrong in the dogma of the magic culture, literally the dogma, that it's some kind of moral crime. Teller says nobody ever died over the secret of a magic trick, so it's hard to make a case it's a moral issue, but it is a very important aesthetic issue. Very, very important. And as Michael Weber says, we don't keep secrets from you, we keep secrets for you. And what happens is, Valentino, the masked magician, his name got out in a week, and although he sold a couple of those specials, then when he went out and tried to tour as an illusionist, his tour crashed and burned, and his career crashed and burned, and for good reason. You know why? Because good magicians don't need to reveal the secrets. They actually create convincing illusions, and lousy magicians need to reveal the secrets because they got nothing better to offer, right? So I think, and there are talks you can find of mine. There are public talks to non-magic groups you can find where I have exposed secrets of magic, but I do it very, very carefully, very judiciously. I make sure it's for a good purpose. And I always make sure that having done that, I reestablish for the audience at the end that they don't really know anything about magic just because I showed them this trick. And then what I usually try to do is, one way or another, I make sure I fool them again to remind them of that. So there's it may not be a moral issue, but it's a deeply important aesthetic issue. And if you just casually expose, like to every idiot, who explains every trick on YouTube, or, all this, a pox on all of them. But the nice thing is, if you watch all my television spots, it's very rare you find explanations in the comments. Isn't that interesting?
All right. That was great. Thank you.